Feels like evening. A learned scientist in the field of geosciences, and he has a career spanning across Australia. We'll forgive him. He's born in Canada. So, it's fine. Look at that look. Professor Marin Van Kranendonk is Kranendonk. Kranendonk, yes, sorry. He now currently lectures at Curtin. He's the head of the School of Earth and Planetary Scientists in the Faculty of Science and Engineering. And one of his interests has been the application of geohistorical research into the possibility of looking fruitfully for early signs of life in other planets. The Pilbara is an old region. It's billions of years old. Australia is quite a stable geological place. And so, apparently I'm told by somebody, whether they're geological or not, we're quite light. So because we're quite light, we float along and we don't explode. So as opposed to a heavy continent, something like this, but I'm sure Professor will tell you more. The point is that there's some old signs of very ancient life in the Pilbara, and how to find those and apply that knowledge to research in, say, Mars, which is coming up, is a fascinating field in which the professor is a learned expert. So this promises to be a fascinating talk and very illuminating. So without any further ado, welcome Professor Van Kranendonk.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to see you're going to all keep me on my toes. We'll pass through to keep it on track with what we wanted. So yes, I was born in Canada, and I fell in love with Perth when I came here after doing my university studies, traveling around Australia. It was actually just at this time of year when all the jacarandas are out, and I came and I thought, well, I can't imagine another more beautiful place on the planet, and I've been very lucky to spend the last 30 years here. I had a bit of a hiatus. I went across to UNSW in Sydney for 12 years, but always missed Perth, and I've had the chance now to return to WA, and I have to say it feels like coming home. So I'm very happy to be back, and lovely to meet you guys as well. So my connection here is through Jeff Jones, who's a long-term friend of ours. My wife and his wife, Rosie, have worked together for many years. We're now in a swimming group that meets down in Cottesloe every Sunday, and he's not here today. So you can see how good a friend he is. But he's actually off on the East Coast playing his walking football, and so he couldn't be here today. But it's my great pleasure. And yes, I wanted to talk to you about the Western Australia connection to the search for life on Mars. And this is a bit of a sciencey talk, but I hope I can lead you through it so that you get exposed to some new ideas and some thoughts about where would you go to look for life on Mars. You've got a whole planet to investigate. Where would you go? And that's where our work comes in. So, I have a secret to share. I am a time traveler. And yes, am I Wolverine, in some of these Marvel comics? Or am I Doctor Who, who's got a little machine I can transport around? No, I look at rocks. And it's these different rocks that are actually time capsules of the history of our planet. So if you go out to the beach, you might be looking at one rock that's only a few hundred years old. You may be looking at others that are hundreds of thousands of years old. And in fact, in this part of the world, you'll be able to see rocks that are millions to billions of years old. And so in that way, I can use those pieces of information to reconstruct what our planet was like going back in time to when the first traces of life are preserved in the geological record, and reconstruct what the world looked like, and then apply that to the search for life on other worlds. So here's an example from a little outcrop in Denmark, where there's a series of big white cliffs, and right in the middle is a dark layer That's all the ash from the wildfires that burned when the dinosaurs went extinct from the energy of the asteroid that impacted Earth and set the entire globe alight. That layer is about that thick, and it marks a turning point in Earth history. And we can walk on that and see the change below and above. That seems a long time ago. And we can go, we can go a lot further back in time and see the changes and sort of recreate those environments. And that includes going back even billions of years ago to the time when the only life on Earth was microbial life, single-celled organisms that made big colonies and started to transform the chemistry of our planet. We can go even further back and with meteorites look at the very start of the solar system, 4.567 billion years ago. And our group here at Curtin does a lot of that work. And in fact, we're working with the Japanese, the Chinese, and the American space agencies on sample material returned from asteroids in deep space. We do the analyses here at Curtin University. And in fact, we can go even further back because some of the elements that we use in our daily life come from events that are even older than our solar system. Who here has gold that they're wearing right now? I've got gold. Most of that gold on Earth is at least 3 billion years old, but it formed from a previous generation of stars that exploded before our sun formed. And in fact, that saying, that rather trite saying of "we are stardust," is absolutely true. It comes from exploding stars through the history of our universe. And I'm very lucky that I get to traipse around on those old time capsules every day. So my work is up in the Northwest, in the Pilbara. I've worked elsewhere all around the world. This is me in my younger days. I still do manage to get out and do some field work, but mostly nowadays I lead field trips for groups that want to see these ancient rocks. So I'm a geologist, but I'm also an astrobiologist. Astro, stars, biology, life is looking for signs of life outside of Earth. And it really addresses those big questions. Are we alone? Where did I come from? How did life get started on Earth? And that, is a big set of questions. And we need really the whole of the scientific community to engage in addressing them. It's not just geologists, it's biologists, it's chemists, it's engineers. It's really the entire community to try and address these very big questions. What I want to do for you today is talk a little bit about that very earliest life. Because Mars, particularly, is a planet whose history as a planet stopped very long ago. It's a lot smaller than Earth, and so it dried up and it cooled off a lot longer ago. So if we're looking for life on Mars, we're actually looking for life back 3.8 or greater billion years ago. And what we know from Earth is that life on Earth at that time was just only made up of single cells. And we think of single cells as incredibly primitive life, but let me tell you, they are unbelievably complex city-states all on their own. This little diagram shows that in a very simplified way, but they have a triple membrane. They've got a little tail that helps them move through the medium. They've got a fluid cytoplasm that is a different composition from the outside. So they have pumps to maintain the gradients of salt and chlorine and various other things. They have specific organelles that are distinct. And of course, they have DNA, which we also have, which is a very long and complicated molecule that does not form in space. It had to form here on Earth through a whole series of reactions. And then the question is, how do you get those complex molecules inside those membranes? How do you develop pumps? It's just so incredibly complicated that we're still literally almost light years away from understanding what that is. What you will hear a lot about if you read about solar system exploration for life is habitable worlds. Has anybody heard of habitable worlds? Habitability? It means an environment where life could live. So I think I was just talking with one of the fellows here about Uranus, and that's now found to have conditions where life might be able to live. Some of the icy moons of Saturn and Jupiter are found to have water underneath the ice. Life could live there. And on Mars, there was evidence for water, so life could live there. But one of the really important advances in science recently has been this understanding that life here is already the product of an incredibly long series of very complicated events that we call prebiotic chemistry. So the chemistry before life. And it turns out that habitable worlds need water. Everywhere on Earth there's life, there's water, right? We can't go 2 days without a drink of water. Things will go very bad. But the conditions to get the chemistry before life got started actually doesn't need water. And this adds a whole other complexity to thinking about where would we go to look for life. These kind of simple molecules here are found in meteorites, and they form the colored bars in this DNA strand. So that's relatively easy to understand. They're everywhere. Those early building blocks of molecules, they were formed in space. But then making them more complex and turning that into DNA and then turning that into a self-replicating mechanism that passes on genetic information into a living organism, that's a whole other bunch of steps. So what we have to think about is, with these kinds of ideas, how did that life get started? What were the processes to make that prebiotic chemistry into life? Now, most of you would be aware that the bulk of thinking around the origin of life now is tied to the oceans. We are a water world, and life is mostly in the oceans. We're not, because we've evolved to live up on land, but most of the biomass is in the oceans. Tell me what you think. Is most of that biomass whales and fish that's in the oceans? I see a few shaking heads. What do you think most of that biomass is? Plankton. The whales eat krill, right? They survive on krill. But actually, by far, the dominant, largest proportion of biomass are single-celled organisms that photosynthesize, and they're called plankton. Exactly. So, and that's true on Earth as well. The largest amount of biomass on our planet, on the crust, it's not trees and elephants and giraffes or humans, it's bugs, single-celled organisms. So the model for life in the deep oceans was that you get these areas called black smokers. And they pump hot fluid, about 400 degrees, down into the crust where it reacts with the rocks and liberates elements and makes some interesting chemistry. So it becomes a bit of a factory. And you can see the temperatures here, 300, 200, 100, cold ocean water. But there are transfer mechanisms for elements that allow life to go on in the deep oceans. And so it's been thought that, well, that could have been the generation of life. Because there are types of microbes that don't need sunlight. They just need chemical energy. So for the last 40, almost 50 years, this has been the main model for thinking about how life got started. And it's because at these deep sea vents, here's one of them, they found tube worms, crabs, all kinds of life, and it's all based on these very small microorganisms that use chemistry, not sunlight, to metabolize. And that was thought to be the case also by genetics, where they found that the most primitive organisms thrived at high temperatures, what are called thermophiles. So some bugs are more effective at about 100 degrees Celsius. And so it's thought, oh, well, that proves that life started in a hot environment. We see all this in the oceans, bang, that's how life got started. But luckily enough, science moves on. That diagram from the 90s has been replaced by a more up-to-date diagram, and it's shown that yes, there are thermophiles near the base of the tree, but actually the most primitive organisms are actually under relatively cool temperatures. So those really hot black smoker environments don't work anymore. So, scientists being adaptive, they shifted their attention to what are called white smokers. Same process. fluid moving down into the crust in the oceans and coming back out, but at a lot colder temperature, about 150 degrees. And instead of really acidic and hot, it's cooler and has carbonate. It's a different chemical factory, but still a chemical factory. But unfortunately, it turns out that this doesn't work out. And it's because of a really simple idea that was found at about the same time as those deep sea vents were first discovered. And it's called the water problem. And I'm not going to go through the chemistry here, but what I want you to understand is that these molecules on the left are common in meteorites. They're formed in space naturally. But to make the complex molecules like proteins, carbohydrates, and DNA, you have to do some reaction chemistry here on Earth. And if you notice, all of the reactions are kicking out a molecule of water. And what that means is if you reverse the action, if you have complex molecules in water, they'll dissolve and break down to their simple counterparts. So you can't make the DNA, the proteins, the sugars in a permanently wet environment. It just does not work. And so this was actually recognized already in the 1980s. It says all biopolymers, that's these compounds, are metastable in aqueous and water in relation to, that's all scientific nonsense, but it just means in 1982, they recognized that these things would break down in water. And a colleague of mine, Dave Deemer, you can heat a solution of these simple molecules in water forever, but no complex molecules will be formed. So this has been a bit of a paradigm shift over the last few years, where these beautiful oceans, the feature of our planet, actually turn out not to be the source for the origin of life. They're too dilute. You can't get any interesting molecules forming. They're too salty. You can't get the drying cycles to make the complex molecules. So it's really now being discussed that life probably got started on land. How do we get those sort of wet, dry cycles? Well, I've put this picture of a geyser here from Iceland, the source of the name of geyser, showing these erupting fountains of water. They occur once every hour, once every couple of days, once every few months, but in the meantime, the area around them will dry out. That's where the chemistry you need for life can happen, when it's drying out. There's a whole bunch of other reasons why hot springs are really exciting. The membranes that I talked about for making cells form in the fresh water of hot springs, but not in the oceans. And they also encapsulate, meaning they contain the organic molecules that can become more complex over time. These are starting to look like actual cells. They also can be compositionally very different, very close by to each other. Who's been to New Zealand, to Rotorua, and gone to see the hot springs? You can have one spring there, you have another one over there. One's hot and bubbling, one's cold and quiet, one's yellow, one's green. Once you start to understand that with a chemistry lens, you go, oh my God, this is literally the witch's brew. This is where complex chemistry happens. So these are just some examples from around the world. An iron-rich one from Yellowstone. This one in Ladakh is rich in boron, where we've done some work. This one in Champagne Pool in New Zealand is precipitating gold. And this one has sulfur. And those fields occur in quite dense clusters close by. These are individual big fields, but each one of those will have 10 to 100 individual pools. Here's Yellowstone. All these black areas are pools. All these green ones are pools with different chemistry, and the red ones are precipitating carbonate. They're just incredibly complex environments. Here's Champagne Pool in New Zealand. Anyone been there? One of my favorite places. It is stunningly beautiful, the colors. But scientifically, it's fascinating as well. Here we've got one pool. This is the bubbling Champagne Pool. It's neutral water, fresh water. It's precipitating gold, and it's rich in CO2. And then just across this little area, we've had another hot spring that's very acidic, pH 2. It's rich in sulfur. And can you see that the whole platform between has got a film of water? And they're exchanging their compositions between them. this is complex chemistry in action. And so that allows you to develop those molecules, but also a lot of different reaction states. And if we think, this is taken from a paper on biology, but it's adapted for this hot spring model idea, that if you start to mix those different pools and do reaction chemistry, you'll see you'll get these different sort of products, some not so good, some all right, and some much better. These will produce a lot of molecules. It's called pools of fitness. And so with that kind of reaction chemistry, you can make wonderful things. Now, we haven't proven that hot springs make life. It's not a simple formula, but in terms of chemistry on Earth, these are the most complex environments anywhere. So with colleagues, we've developed this model about the new origins of life in hot springs, and we're really pretty sure that hot springs are the way to go for a whole bunch of reasons. Now, you know that science advances stands on the shoulders of giants. Well, we're not the first to say this model. A fellow called Charles Darwin, back in 1871, said this famous quote. I don't know if anybody knows it, but the first part's very famous, and the second part not so much, but I think it's absolutely important. I think this was one of the most insightful sentences in all of our human history for science. And it was in a letter to his friend, Joseph Hooker. But if, and in brackets, oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. Now that's Darwinian evolution applied to a chemical system. Isn't that incredible? I think that's absolutely incredible. So I take my hat off to Charles Darwin, but I am an academic, so I have to assess his thesis. And I would say that instead of some, I would say a few warm little ponds, and he's forgotten about borate in there. But overall, pretty good. I give him a 92%. All right, so what about the Australian connection? The fellow who introduced me told you about the Pilbara. That's where I've worked for the last 30 years. It's one of the oldest, best preserved pieces of crust in the world. Really one of only two. And it has the oldest traces of life. These little squiggly structures here in rocky outcrops that are only 2 hours drive from Port Hedland. It's in the middle of nowhere. That's becoming increasingly more busy with mining. And I was lucky enough to get started there as a mapping geologist for the Geological Survey of Western Australia. And I've been involved with their protection. And we've applied a National Heritage Listing application for their protection, because this is the oldest trace of our ancestry in the world. And it's so well preserved, you can still see the ripples on the shoreline 3.5 billion years ago. And this just shows our timeline from today, going back to 4.5. The first 500 million years, there's no geological record. Big meteorites were coming in and pummeling the Earth and just dissolving the rocks in the oceans. No chance for life. But already, at 3.5, we have very well established evidence for large areas covered by colonies of billions of microbes. And that's quite startling, because it means that life was able to get started pretty quickly. Once that meteorite bombardment tailed off, life was able to get going. In fact, there are even stromatolites that I've worked on at 3.7 billion years from Greenland, but they're harder to interpret. Anyway, we've been able to prove through drilling and scientific analysis that those structures in the rocks were made by life because they have this very distinctive texture. Here, these are only 0.5 centimeter high, these little columns. And when we look, they're made up of this very unusual type of pyrite. Has anybody heard of fool's gold? So pyrite is fool's gold. It's very common on Earth, but normally it forms big crystals, solid crystals. But in these stromatolites, these colonies of microbes, these rock structures, they preserve this spongy texture. And if we look in detail at the inside of these things, we can actually see preserved microfossils. These are the cells of life, 3.5 billion years old, still with organic carbon. So these structures were made by life. Now, how many of you think that that's absolute rubbish? How can life make a rock? What's this? What's this? It's a mineral. We are making rock in our heads. Bone is a mineral. Our nails are a type of mineral. Life makes minerals. And those minerals get precipitated in the rock record and preserved for us to see them billions of years later. So when somebody says you have rocks in your head, say, yes, thank you. So what was our planet like 3.5 billion years ago? Well, if I could sit on a pier and sip a pina colada looking out of the ocean, I would see that our oceans were green, not blue, because they were rich in dissolved iron. This is before there was oxygen in the atmosphere. Oxygen was produced by those very microbes, those rock-making microbes. That didn't happen until 2.5 billion years ago. So before that, we would have green oceans, we would have had orange skies because it was mostly carbon dioxide, and that filters the sunlight differently. And if there were any land masses, they would have been black volcanic rocks, like Hawaii or the Galapagos. Hot mantle material coming up and making these island continents. So if I was able to have a spaceship and look back on our planet 3.5 billion years ago, we would see a green water world with black land masses and fluffy orange clouds. So a very different planet. Our world has changed dramatically over its history. That life we've been able to reconstruct as having formed in a volcanic caldera, just like this one in Tonga, where a big volcano has blown its top and left behind a lake that stews with warm water. And on the edge of that lake in Tonga, we get these microbial buildups, these stromatolites, just as we see 3.5 billion years ago. A big advance in our understanding of that early life came through a PhD student of mine, Tara Jokic, while I was over at UNSW in the East. She found this little rock, literally about this big, from that environment where the old fossils were found. And when you cut it open, it has these really amazing little bulbous textures and this black and white layering. Very complicated structure. And it turns out that it's only made in one way. It's made from a splashing geyser, and we can tell that because this is the texture from that ancient rock 3.5 billion years ago, and this is the texture from a hot spring in New Zealand 10 years ago. They are exactly the same. And so this rock was made by a splashing geyser, and it sits directly over where the stromatolites were formed. So the oldest life on Earth is preserved in shallow water at hot springs on land, not in the deep oceans like that hot spring, that black smoker model. So this is part of the reason why we've changed our thinking about where life may have come from, partly because of this geological record. It also has the elements for making life and had the capacity for these wet-dry cycles. So we feel that hot springs are the way to go. And this natural geoheritage that we have up in the Pilbara is used for training scientists from the major space agencies who are looking for life. I've now done 4 field trips for NASA, including the science teams of the exploration rovers that are actively searching for life on Mars now. We have them all gathered around the outcrops here, looking at those signs of life and the habitats so that they could go and explore better on Mars. So we have a global impact in this great science race. And I wanted to just try and play this. If I can get this to go. There's a little video. This is
One of the biggest questions for humanity is, are we alone?
Is there life elsewhere in the universe? Or is Earth somehow special? The science of astrobiology helps to try and answer these questions by investigating how life got started on our planet. But the question is, where to look? We've got a whole planet to search for. Where would you go to find those faint traces of life getting its first foothold on a new world? The project that we've got going here with NASA and the European Space Agency is we're using the information on early Earth here to inform us about exploring on early Mars.
Many of those questions are of great interest to just the general public. Are we alone in the universe? Where did we come from? How did the world evolve? And what about the context of the world and the solar system and the rest of the universe out there? When you look at Mars and you look at Earth, especially early in Mars's history, it was much more Earth-like. So, both planets are largely made out of the same kinds of rocks. Long ago, we see evidence on Mars's surface that there was liquid water at the surface, running water, and we see that there are volcanoes and other kinds of heat sources. So, you put two and two together, then maybe Mars, early in its history, like Earth, was habitable. And so we're sending the rover to go interrogate the geologic rock record on Mars from a long time ago to see if there are any signs that life might have left behind.
We will have 2 rovers with different instruments in 2 different locations. ExoMars will be capable of drilling down to 2 meters in the subsurface, so it would provide a sort of depth profile, while Mars Van Kranendonk won't drill in the subsurface, but will select samples at the surface that will be then bring back to Earth within Mars Sample Return Station.
So Marin Van Kranendonk at the University of New South Wales, the director of the Australian Centre for Astrobiology, is one of the leading experts. He knows the Pilbara just about better than anybody. He's one of the few people who spends a lot of time up here really studying the geology and the rocks and the life, the evidence for life that exists here. So he has a lot of history, and it's important to tap into his knowledge base and his students. He's been training students for several years now. They all have a really deep knowledge of this area.
The opportunity to walk on the shore of Earth 3.5 billion years ago is an extraordinary experience for everyone. And I really feel that that's a beautiful gift that Australia can give to the rest of the world. So we are, as I said, we're trying to set that aside and make sure it's protected. And once it's protected, then open it up for the rest of our community to be able to go and visit themselves. There are samples of these materials in the museum, but seeing them in the field is another experience altogether. So what about Mars? Incredibly far away, much further away from the sun, and so a lot colder. And the question then is, of course, where would you go to look for life in that early history? As Mitch said on that video, it's early history, and I just point out the timeline here. So the rocks that I'm looking at in the Pilbara are 3.5 billion, and actually Mars, back to 4.2, was what's called warm and wet, because we see lots of evidence for flowing water. And that's when we think Mars may have been habitable for life. Probably not so much now. NASA uses this mantra in its exploration of follow the water. Because of that idea of everywhere there's life on Earth, there's water. And in fact, everywhere there's water, there's life. Even the clouds have bacteria. And so they've gone to an area here in Jezero Crater where an ancient river has cut down through the rim of an impact crater and deposited a beautiful little delta, and they want to look for signs of life in the sediments in the front part of the delta where the finest grain material is, these clays. And we were at the landing site workshops to determine where to send the rover, and we advocated for another place that we'll talk about soon, and we realized that we were up against an incredible advertising agency. The group that was advocating for the Jezero Delta, they provided this model. as their basis for going to search for life there. And think about this now, Mars, 3.8 billion years ago. Is there anything about this diagram that strikes you as odd? Or maybe a little bit wishful thinking? So to us it looks very natural because it looks like a picture from Earth. There's green all over these delta. That means it's covered by life. And the water is blue. So that means there must have been oxygen in the atmosphere. Really? This is a very, very good piece of advertising to get your thoughts across. When I asked them where they would search for life and what kind of life it would be, they said, oh, well, actually, no, it wouldn't be, photosynthetic life on the surface like that. It would be chemical life in the water in the front of the delta using the chemical. So when you spoke to them, their real interpretation was completely different to what they drew. And I learned a lot from that. Not that I use that practice myself, of course. Here's what the reality is of what they've found so far. This is the most simple type of molecule that we can say was made exclusively by life here on Earth. And that goes back to about 1.6 billion years ago. On Mars, they found just a single ring of carbon with a bit of chlorine. There's no indications that that was made by life. So they're very far away from their objective of finding life in the rocks that they're looking at. They've done the same thing now 3 times. So three different rovers they've gone to look at deltas, and each time the rover's getting more complicated, bigger, more expensive. Perseverance rover is the size probably of from me to the end of the table, like a big SUV. It's got 11 science instruments on it. It costs $2 billion to put onto the surface of Mars. That's up sampling for a whole bunch of materials and is doing an incredible job. The engineers are absolutely world leading, but it's expensive. And the idea of getting those samples off requires a lander 10 meters in diameter to get a few little samples about the size of your pinky off the surface of Mars. That's going to cost $11 billion. The technology's not been developed. They've ramped up and up and up and up, but they're reaching a fiscal boundary where their dreams are actually no longer supportable by the costs. So, could there be another model? This is where our group comes in, based around the science from Western Australia. We've developed a mission concept that we call Life Springs Mars, to go and collect very focused samples from a place that NASA has already been and found samples of hot springs on Mars, 3.5 billion years ago. Bring them back to Earth and look for signs of life. It's a light and nimble, low-cost mission architecture that can be achieved by a single launch from Earth. It addresses those fundamental questions of humanity we talked about in astrobiology. It's science-based. It's led by an international team of world experts based on Australian geology, and it targets those hot spring deposits. What we're aiming to bring back is a piece only this big, in triplicate so we can replicate our scientific studies, but with the analytical tools available here on Earth at Curtin University, we can do a world of science on something that big. So it's light. We don't need a big rover. We know where the samples are. We can just go and get them. That means it can be relatively low cost. And because life is so complicated, to prove ancient life is so difficult, forget about doing a little bit of science on Mars, do all the science here on Earth. So we don't need 11 scientific instruments to get those samples. We think that for Australia, this is an opportunity to showcase our nation's capability in developing bespoke technologies to show what we can do, and in that way, stay ahead of the world. The area we're planning to go to is where the Spirit rover had gone around a place called Home Plate. It ended up getting stuck in sand dunes on the western side, but when it was traversing the eastern side of the structure, it found beautiful deposits of opaline silica. This is an actual picture from the surface of Mars by the Spirit rover. And these white nodules, the geological hammer is not real, that we put on there for scale, but these outcrops are very unusual. Usually geological materials are layered because they're pushed by wind or water, sand on the beach form layered structures, but these are nodules, and the nodules have finger-shaped sort of protrusions coming off them. When they found them back in the early 2000s, they'd never seen anything like it before. They didn't know what they were. But a colleague of mine at Arizona State University, Steve Ruff, went to the Atacama Desert in Chile and found exact replicas of those structures in a hot spring at 3,000 meters, where it's high UV from the sun, high evaporation. This is the hot spring channel here, and these are nodules at the same scale with exactly the same kinds of features. Here's a close-up of those structures on Mars, taken by Spirit. That's as close as it was able to go with their technology at the time. And this is the same scale, showing these nodules. And notice these finger-shaped kind of textures. I call this Maradona's hand of God, you know, when he scored that famous goal. And we can see exactly the same thing here. And when you break one of those little teeth off, you see here's the underside, and when you look inside, they're packed with microfossils. And it turns out that those nodules and those finger-shaped things are actually built by microbes in the same way that we make our teeth. So this is kind of a holy cow moment. What are we looking at on Mars? We feel that these are the best targets possible to search for ancient life on the red planet. How would it work? Well, the idea is that with a single launch, we would put one component onto the surface of Mars. That's where we collect the samples. A second component would take a satellite and park it in deep space while we do the surface operations. Once we collect the samples, that would go into a little ascent rocket that then docks with that satellite, puts a little CubeSat into that satellite then swings back and deposits the samples here in the Australian desert. Sounds simple, right? Yeah. Apparently it's not so simple. There are lots of challenges. But we're trying to build a team here in WA and then work with international partners to kind of block out the mission. There's the launch component, the surface ops, that ascent rocket, the CubeSat, the relay, and see if we can get international interest to defray the cost and share in the big mission. Why would we think about a space mission for Mars? What's in it for you guys? What's in it for our children, our grandchildren? It's expensive. A mission like this, light and nimble, low cost, still billions of dollars. But the reality is, we're in a situation where Australia is in a critical area of not having skilled workers for allowing our economy to grow. And space is a way to attract students into STEM. And in fact, this kind of investment is really not that much. There was recently an announcement by the federal government for $1 billion to develop quantum computing. Resourcing Australia's prosperity through the Geoscience Australia is at $3.4 billion over 35 years. Those kinds of monies are around. And I think there are great benefits in terms of soft diplomacy, of building a consortium of countries around, non-defense alliance. It'll help foster our economic growth and stimulate our students into STEM. We have a lot of different ways that we can contribute to this. We have the Deep Space Network that's been in place since the Apollo era and has helped space exploration for many decades now. We have a Mission Control Center that's funded by the WA government. We're very good at robotics and remote operation of vehicles because of the mining legacy here. We have all the analytical equipment we need. A whole bunch of reasons why Australia can really play in this game. And so I think there are exciting days ahead, and glad that I could share that with you today. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Any questions? It's more about the whole
So I know it's a big sciencey talk, but don't be scared if you have any thoughts or questions about anything to do with the solar system or planetary exploration.
Do you think that life was created, or do you think it happened organically? How do you think it all started?
Well, Yes, that's literally the $11 billion question. And you know, many people have different thoughts about that, and the fact is we haven't been able to prove how life got started. But what's been exciting is that we are now in a much better place of knowing the many different steps required to get there. What is exciting is that we have a lot more knowledge about what's going on in space. And that includes making very complex chemistry in outer space. So has anybody heard of the Murchison meteorite? There are samples of it in a museum. It fell, I think, 52, 54 years ago in the little town of Murchison, Victoria. I was invited to speak there at the anniversary of its 50th anniversary of its fall. It was a meteorite that exploded as it came into Earth and shattered fragments all around. And I know a guy who grew up there, and he went out to pick up fragments, and they put some of them in a jar. They're these black space rocks. And when you open the jar, even today, and you smell, it's got an oily smell. Because one of the most common elements in space is carbon. What are we? Carbon and a bit of water. And some other things. Carbon is actually incredibly common. All those asteroids that the spaceships have visited, they have these beautiful pictures and they look like these gray blobs. They're actually unbelievably black. They have to highlight the light from them because they're mostly carbon. And the carbon starts to form molecules that are the building blocks in DNA. So all of that sort of pre-chemical work is done in space, and then it's delivered to Earth. It's still coming in on Earth. Who's got their own home still? Old home with gutters around the roof that you haven't cleaned in 10 years. If you take a big magnet into those gutters, you can pull out tiny little micrometeorites that are nickel rich. There's still space material and chemistry coming in every year. Tens of thousands of kilograms around the world, just as dust. And in early Earth, that would have been a rain of organic matter. Hot springs everywhere. Volcanoes. Just a very reactive environment. So our current understanding suggests that the processes were available here. We've now made RNA in the lab and we've made DNA through these abiotic processes, but we still don't understand how you make something living. So that question is still very open. Stromatolites now are on the decline and have been ever since the rise of the Cambrian explosion because they get eaten by bigger animals. But for the first 3 billion years of Earth history, they're the only fossil, and they're everywhere. So there are now, has anybody been up Shark Bay? Seen the stromatolites there? So they look like rocks, and in fact they weren't identified as living structures until actually just the early 1960s, when I was born. And there's some down at Mandurah, Lake Clifton, there's some out at Rottnest. So in these extreme environments, in caves and hot springs, you see stromatolites all over. But they need extreme environments, because if it's just nice, happy water, the snails will eat them, the crabs will eat them, the fish will eat them, and they can't build up. Yes. So that the stromatolites at Shark Bay, at Mandurah, they're still growing. And it's the whole core of it is rock, because those are layers that have died, and the living surface is just a very thin surface on the top. But that's made up of billions of microbes, and their life activity takes the minerals that are in solution in seawater and precipitates them out to make the rock. So that's how stromatolites are formed. So there are ancient ones, fossilized, and living ones still growing. Yeah.
When we were in New Zealand a couple of years back, we can't remember exactly where the rocks on the south coast. But one of the beaches there, he said, you almost perfectly around the rocks. Where did that come from? What did it happen?
So the question was, on the south coast of New Zealand, there are these very beautiful round rocks. They're called the Malacup marbles, or there's something like that. Does anybody know the name? Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Now, I don't know. They're not stromatolites. They're solid. They split in half. I think I know what they are. I don't actually know. I've not seen them. But in shales, in mudstones that are deposited in deep water, when the organic matter, those black shales have a lot of organic matter. When they start breaking down, they cause the chemistry to change and minerals start to grow around them. And you get these nodules that grow, and they can form very hard things that are then lumped out. Yeah, I've heard about that. It's amazing. Yeah, an ancient bowling field. Yeah.
Would you like to comment on wave rock?
So Wave Rock down in the southeast of WA is a big platform of granitic rocks. And so most of the crust, not here in Perth. Perth is a beach, right? It's all sand. It's an old beach that was lifted out of the water. But once you go up in the hills, you get into very ancient granites, and that extends all the way up to Kalgoorlie, all the way up to Monolobor, all the way down to Esperance. Those are all very old rocks. And wave rock, those rocks have been exposed for a very long time. And they develop a bit of a hard crust, like a thick skin on the top. And in places, that thick top gets eroded through, and then the rocks underneath are softer. And that causes that kind of erosion to be sculpted out, and wind goes through, and very long-term processes. But does anybody know why Australia is so flat? This is part of the story about that. So I hear some questions, some thoughts. Sorry? No. Partly. But there are very old rocks that are in mountainous areas. So why is the whole of Australia so flat? We heard of Gondwana, the ancient continent of Gondwana. So about 300 million years ago, Australia was at the South Pole, tied to Antarctica, neighbors to India, Africa, and South America, all stitched together. And all of Australia was covered by an ice sheet, like the current ice sheet over Antarctica. 3 to 4 kilometers thick for tens to 100 of millions of years. And the ice flows out to the sea, and it has rocks in it, and it just grinds and grinds and grinds. So Australia was ground flat 250 million years ago. And then it broke away and started to move north and warmed up. The ice melted, and then those rocks have sat exposed for a long time. But about 35 million years ago, Australia was covered by a tropical rainforest. And now it's in this kind of semi-desert environment. It's just that change, natural change. And just a comment about change, because we're all living in a period of change. Those geological periods of change are very slow, very long periods of time, tens to hundreds of millions of years. What's happening for us now, why it's so hot today, and our temperatures are going up and up, is around climate change that is being affected on the order of tens of years. It's a similar kind of change. We know the temperature of the atmosphere, the climate of Earth has changed dramatically over time, but now it's just happening so quickly. So, there's absolutely. That phrase you hear all the time, the burning of fossil fuels, is putting carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, and those greenhouse gases trap the heat. Now that has happened in the past. These big volcanic excursions, mass extinctions, all because of volcanic activity doing the same thing. But we're doing it at a scale and a rate that's not been seen before. And so it's a process we're familiar with in geology, but it's at a rate that's
As to the question of whether we're alone, you can say a picture of crash formations.
yes, there have been great ideas about little green men on Mars since very early days. It actually started with the very early telescopes that weren't very accurate. And they saw these streaks on Mars. And there was an Italian guy who must have had a very powerful imagination. He thought they were canals dug by a very advanced civilization across the entire planet. Turned out they were dust streaks from planetary-wide dust storms. But since that idea, it's really caught on, and we're still following on that legacy. Is there life on Mars?
you explain the world split of the continent?
Yeah.
How do you explain the animals in each part are completely different?
So, yes, they are. No, they're not. There's actually a bit of both. There are some animals that are common across those different continents, but evolution continues as the continents drift. So tortoises, they're found on many of the different continents, and that's because tortoises evolved before Gondwana split apart. But then a whole separate lineage of animals evolved once those continents were all separated. So once Australia had left Antarctica, South America, Africa, and India on its drift north, it continued to evolve. And now those animals are unique here in Australia because they evolved after Gondwana split apart. Didn't know that, huh? I'm sorry, I have to go. I have work to do. But it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope that I'll be able to see you again.
We have our ritual where, firstly, it's wonderful to have such an, well-spoken and explanatory scientist. It's a wonderfully illuminating thing for all of us. A big hand for Professor. And now the important part, Professor, you have to choose a raffle. The raffle prize. I'll shake the thing. There we go.
Orange C27.
Orange C27.
We have a winner.
Coles Group gift card. Thank you. There you go. Indeed, a winner. Indeed. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Look forward to seeing you all at the Christmas lunch, and for those who are coming to the concert, at the Christmas concert.